So this is a program of Project Drawdowns. As you probably know, if you are here already, Project Drawdown is a nonprofit whose mission is to be really the world's leading resource for science-based climate solutions. There's a lot of confusion out there about how to be the most effective when it comes to addressing climate change. We try to cut through all the noise and all the hoopla and use science and evidence and data to find out what works and what works best to address climate change. Of all the many things we have to do, what are the things that could be most effective? And today, of course, we'll be hearing about food waste, which is one of the most effective solutions we believe to address climate change. Our work is based on three key pillars. We do the science to advance effective science-based solutions. We work with stakeholders, especially investors and philanthropists and business leaders. That's you. Hopefully, all of you in the audience are folks from this community, which we are really excited about. And we also try to tell better stories of people implementing climate solutions, kind of taking the data off the page and into the real world by showing stories of effective action. Today, we're really going to focus on the question of food loss and food waste around the world and why trimming back on this critical issue, trimming back on food waste, can be a powerful climate solution as well as a solution to many other issues like food security, biodiversity, water, etc. And this is part of our ongoing Drawdown Deep Dives session. This is the second one of our so-called deep dives. And we're focusing on what we call the kind of emergency brake climate measures. The climate measures will be kind of faster than usual, the disproportionately fast climate solutions that could help get us back on track. The first session was focusing on deforestation, but now for the next few deep dives, we're focusing on solutions that touch on things like methane and um, other kinds of issues that can actually dramatically bend the curve on climate change faster than other climate solutions. So that's kind of the idea of these larger sessions. These are high priority climate actions because we're so far behind in where we need to be. Pulling the emergency brakes now is going to be a critical way of catching up and getting back on track. In these sessions, we're going to be kind of giving an overview of the science, looking at the current status and trends and kind of drivers of these possible climate solutions, but also what their barriers may be and what we could do to help accelerate them into the real world, and especially pathways for strategic action by philanthropists, investors, businesses, and so on. So we're going to talk about the science, we're going to talk about the strategy, and we're going to talk about how you all in the private sector can help accelerate these solutions and remove some of the key barriers that we are facing today. What we're hoping for is to really help you catch up to speed very quickly on this critical issue that we're reaching out to business, investor, and philanthropic audiences. And again, we want to spend these sessions really talking about how we unlock and accelerate this critical kind of climate action, whether it's around policy or business innovation and practice, whether it's deploying capital, private investor capital, philanthropic capital, publicly traded money, government funding, you name it, as well as the kind of technical innovations and scientific barriers we face. And most of all, how we face these kind of cultural and behavioral barriers to things like addressing food waste. We'll be looking at all those over the next few sessions and talking to you about how we can work together to unlock these. And we're hoping that you and the audience are part of the community that can help us really move these levers of change using different kinds of capital in particular, whether it's philanthropic capital, impact, venture, private equity, you name it. We're really interested in seeing how we can deploy resources to drive and support tactics for reducing food waste, this critical emergency brake, and help us address climate change in the process. So that's kind of what we're doing today. We're going to be focusing a lot on the question of food waste, which at one time kind of feels very familiar to all of us. So all we have to do is look at our refrigerators. But at the same time, there's a lot of misunderstanding about where the most important levers are in food loss and food waste and how we can address them together. So I think we're all going to learn a little bit today, and some of it might be surprising. We are doing these kind of drawdown deep dives over the course of this year in partnership with a bunch of great organizations. In particular, today, the ReFed. ReFed, who you'll be hearing from in a few minutes, is a really world-leading nonprofit focusing on food loss, food waste, and what we can do about it. Whenever I hear anybody talk about food waste, I say, you've got to learn about ReFed. It is the best place in town to learn about these issues. And like Drawdown, it focuses on practical solutions. They just go so deep on this issue and are really the world's leading experts on this. So if you have any questions about food loss and food waste, ReFed is the place to go. We also provide some partnership here I'm sorry, we work in partnership here on the deep dives with two other organizations, Climate Lead, a leading nonprofit that focuses on accelerating powerful climate philanthropy, and Tonic, a network of family offices and impact investors that are trying to deploy private capital in the most effective ways for social and environmental good. So we're really proud to work with Refed, Climate Lead, and Tonic on these deep dives. And today, I really have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, Dr. Paul West from Project Drawdown. He's going to be kicking off our session today to give kind of a science overview at the global scale of food loss and food waste and kind of where the big levers are in that system. You're in good hands today, folks. Paul is a world leading ecologist and a brilliant scientist, thinker, and communicator. Paul got his doctorate at the University of Wisconsin as an ecologist and then worked for many years with the Nature Conservancy, leading very large international programs on rivers and ecosystems around the world, but also here in the United States. He then moved to the University of Minnesota, leading big initiatives on global food security and its relationships to the environment, working with public and private sector partners, scientists, nonprofits, governments all around the world. He's also been with now Drawdown for a few years as one of our senior scientists leading work on climate solutions, but especially climate solutions that touch nature and ecosystems as well as human societies. He's been really pioneering great work on these kind of win-win-win climate solutions that advance climate solutions and solutions for nature and people at the same time. Paul is a real expert in all these issues. He's also one of the top 1% most cited scientists in the world in his fields, and is just a remarkable scientist and somebody we should all listen to. So, with that, I will hand it over to Paul West to take it away and to tell us more about global patterns of food waste.
As you mentioned, I'm Paul West. A little bit of housekeeping, I guess, is I'm a person who stutters. So at times it might just take me a bit, but I'll get there. Um, and with that, I will start to share my slides. So let's start out with what is food waste. As John had mentioned, that there is both is food loss and waste, and just a little bit of a separation of the two is if you look across a supply chain from where our food is produced to is where it ends up on our plate. Um, what is considered like a loss of food really is in that uh, upstream area, and then what is wasted is more like what's at the grocery stores and in our refrigerators, our trash bins, etc., as well as at restaurants. Um, and why is this important, and why is it an emergency brake? Um, so as a first thing, as far as why it's important, in places like in the US and Europe, Australia, it really is more of a waste issue. But in a number of places in the world, in particular areas where there is lower income uh, and high rates of of hunger, there it's more of a food loss issue, and then as a result of that, it's more of a food security issue there, as opposed to more like in the U.S., where again it's mostly a waste issue. And if you look at the agricultural, like our system as a whole, if you're looking at like where our food is produced, and and what is produced and how it is produced. About a quarter of all the emissions on the planet are from our food system, and oftentimes that isn't as well known. So it's it's more than or than like all of the planes, trains, and automobiles on the planet as far as the emissions. And unfortunately, about a third or so of what is produced in the fields is either is lost or it's wasted. And Refed and others have estimated that, like in the US, that's about the equivalent of 400 pounds of food each year. And so when we think about like our food system and the amount of food waste, um, one thing that oftentimes it comes up as far as an idea for a solution is taking all of our waste and composting it. And while that is a solution, the amount of emissions from what ends up in the landfills is about is 2 or 3% of the overall emissions on the planet. So if you look at the combination of landfills and wastewater, that is 4%, and landfills are about half or a little more of that. So it's important, but it's a small-ish part of all the emissions. But it's still super important, and that is because what ends up in the landfills, what is going in there as organic matter, and it breaks down, what is released is methane. So, and it is only in the atmosphere for a short amount of time. So in that time, it packs a huge punch. So having a focus on reducing the amount of food loss and waste has a big impact on our wallets, our economy, and certainly our climate. So what I'm showing here is that most of the impact of our our food system is happening upstream. So as far as looking at a range of solutions, say if it's composting, that's more of a recycling issue. So to have the most impact, we have to focus on prevention and reuse. In my talk, I'm mainly going to be have a focus on prevention. And Refed is the expert on both that and on reuse. So I mentioned that the amount of food waste is a small-ish amount of emissions as compared to all the emissions from agriculture in general. So as a result of that, when we are thinking about food waste, we have to think about the whole system. So from what happens on the farm, what ends up on our plate, and what eventually ends up in a landfill. So I showed that there's a small piece of emissions in industry that is from landfills, but the actual large impact of the food system really happens um, on the farms. So if in conversations, the a common narrative is that a lot of the impact of food happens as a result of food miles or the packaging, or whether it is conventional or it's organic or if it's GMOs. But if you look at the data, you find that most of the emissions are from where our food is grown. So how much land is cleared, which is still happening around the world and mainly in the tropics, how much land is cleared for more agricultural land. Then uh, our cattle and goats and sheep, when they are eating, they end up as part of processing all their food is burp a lot, and those burps are methane. And then is the impact of how land is managed. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here. So when we are looking at the impacts of where our food is produced, um, so I was saying before is that across the tropics is that there is still a lot of clearing for more agriculture. So this is a slide from our colleagues at WRI, where they have this ongoing analysis of updating what are the drivers of deforestation. And those areas that you see in orange and yellow are areas that in the last uh, uh, in the last uh, 25 years where forests have been cleared and now are used for agriculture. Again, that's the orange and the yellow areas. So other things are the what. So if you look at the impacts of cattle, that's about is 5% of all the emissions on the planet. And as I said before, it's a result of as they are are, are digesting all their food that you end up with a lot of burping, which is methane. And lastly, if you look at which is a similar amount to methane, if you look at it in total, um, how we are managing our soils, irrigation and fertilizer, that also has an impact. So again, it's fertilizer, irrigation, um, and burning of fuels or of fields after after a harvest. So a second area that I want to talk about is what is wasted uh, matters a lot. So certainly all food waste is bad, but some foods have more of an impact than others, and that's a result of the of where it's grown and what is produced and how it's produced that I shared in the previous slides. So what you are seeing here is those are the bars with the longer length have more of an impact for each pound or kilogram of food. And you see that most of the emissions come from is meat and dairy, um, and what certainly has an outsized impact is beef. So for a next couple of slides, I'm going to have us play a little game, or I'm going to share a story of looking at if you have, say, a half pound of burger. Let's look at what else it could fit in the bag with the same amount of impact on climate. So what you find is that if you're having like it's bread and olives and cheese, it's uh, it's more weight in terms of mass, but in terms of impact on climate, it's it's still a lot smaller. And then if you look at it and you add a couple of pounds of broccoli and carrots, a pound of tofu, a couple of potatoes and veggies, and rice, you still have way more in terms of weight, but only about half the amount of impact on climate as a burger. So you might say, well, yeah, I like cheese and tofu, maybe, maybe not. I like it, but um, and so if someone says, well, all that's nice, but um, I want some meat. So if you add, say, a pound of salmon, you add another, amount of weight, but still just a small amount in terms of impact on climate. And then if you say, no, 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 I don't like fish. I want chicken. Well, if you add a pound of chicken on, you still have a smaller impact on climate. And then, it's nice to also have a little fruit or some wine, and you still have enough left over a carbon budget for a couple of cups of coffee, and a little bit of chocolate as well. So in this next section, I'm going to show like where is waste, is it happening around the world? So here I'm going to show a number of maps. First, though, is to look at that in some places in the world, as I mentioned early on, is that um, so if you look across a supply chain and regions of the world, that can help you understand which climate solutions or waste solutions are most impactful in different places. So if you look at like in North America, Europe, and parts of Asia, most of the waste is happening at the consumer end. So a redistribution of food is a very impactful solution there. But if you're looking at other places in the world, and again, it's largely where the uh, prevalence of hunger is a lot higher, most of what is lost in the system is in storage or still on the field as a result of pests, say, or rodents. So knowing that, we can start to look at and see that most of the impact from food waste, and this is globally, happen in a few set of countries. So if you look at landfills, our colleagues at Trace have assembled information on all the landfills of the world, or at least is 9,625 of them. Um, and then we had looked at the numbers a little bit, and we saw that, a small number of landfills really have an outsized impact. And so while it's important to do like efforts everywhere, there are a handful of areas that really have a high impact. And just as a side note, our colleagues at uh, Industrious Labs recently had a report that a handful of small changes in policies and management of landfills could it's cut the amount of emissions in half from all of our landfills in the US. So if you look at how much is wasted, around the world, as I mentioned early on, is that about a third of all the food as a global average is wasted. But certainly there are hotspots of how much of our food is wasted. Um, and you'll see like even in areas like in in India, has a large population, or the biggest on the planet, that the amount of wasted is really small. The other extreme is like in the U.S. And then if you look at it in terms of how much emissions for each individual, it's oh, that is wasted. So if you look at it in terms of, well, how does that amount of waste it turn into emissions? Um, you can then start to see um, an impact in terms of climate and not just amount of food. Um, So, like, if you're looking at, well, how much impact on the climate for each person, what we find is that in the US, it's about 30% of all the emissions from our food system in the US. And that's important to note that it's equivalent of because some of the emissions are happening elsewhere, and then they are imported into the U.S. But it has a very large impact. So a question then is, well, how much of all that's wasted is beef? Because as I shared before, it really has an outsized impact. So if you look at all the emissions for each country, what this map is showing here is how much of those emissions are explained by the amount of beef that is wasted. And so here's an example of a small or a small shift in either the amount of food that is wasted or is part of our diet. It can have an outsized impact. Then here's um, a fun fact or a gross fact, I don't know, but there are other ways of looking at this as well. And so, for example, within the US, a very small number of people are eating most of the beef. So if you're looking at like where to have an influence on climate that is related to all our food that's wasted, there's a targeted a group of people that could have this big outsized impact. So as I'm wrapping up here, a couple of things that I mainly mentioned is that most of the impact is upstream of uh, uh, a landfill. So it's how our food is produced, what is produced, um, and where it is produced. Also, I highlighted that what is wasted, that matters a lot. And then also then I highlighted that there's a small set of places around the world that really have an outsized impact. Then I'll close with, I'm sure a number of people have seen this, but is Michael Pollan's excellent, just extremely short. Uh, uh, his food rules, just to add a little bit of nuance to it in the context of waste, is to uh, only buy what you are needing, eat it, and don't waste it. So next, I'm going to hand